Good afternoon. Welcome to the CFES Brilliant Pathways webinar series focused on educational topics, featuring experts and thought leaders in a wide range of fields. My name is John Rydell. I'm Director of Online Programs and Content, and very excited to introduce today's guest, Representative Yvette Clarke, Congresswoman from the 9th District of New York. In Brooklyn, I was just looking that there's 2.4 million people in her district, and I'm calling in from Vermont where there's 600,000. So she has just a few more people where she's at. We have some schools in New York with us today, 2 in her district. Among others, we've got Northside, Brooklyn Institute for Liberal Arts, Eximius, and a host of others. So I would love to start by having Representative Clarke talk a little about her own pathway in New York and kind of where she got to be. I know our students love to hear inspirational stories like hers, and hers is pretty impressive. So I'll turn it over to Representative Clarke.
Well, first of all, thank you for inviting me, John, and to the CFES Brilliant Pathways Education family. It's great to be with you today and to engage in this conversation with the students of Central and South Brooklyn. I am a hometown girl through and through. Born and raised in Brooklyn, New York, represent the constituency that I've lived in all my life, and absolutely have a wonderful story to tell. So it just so happens that I had all of my formative years of education in the very congressional district that I represent. So, I mean, I never really left home in a way. I came up in New York City as a child of the early 70s, sort of, coming of age in the 80s in Brooklyn, New York. And as a result of that, when we talk about education, it was very different then. You have to think about the times and put it in historical context. During that time in our nation, the Brown v. Board of Education decision was relatively new. And it was being, certain provisions of it were being implemented across the nation to desegregate our school systems, our public school systems. Coming up in Central Brooklyn at the time that I did, the community was predominantly people of African descent. And so my early years in the elementary school were spent in classrooms where a lot of the students looked just like me. We had a great public school system that was focused on the education of the children in the community in a unique way, because the system was so different then, and people were so conscious of sort of the deficits in education across the country. And New York was no different. Brooklyn was no different. But I had great teachers, and I loved to learn. And my parents were immigrants to the United States, and to them, the value of education was worth more than gold. And so my parents were very focused on making sure that I got the very best education that I could possibly receive through a public school system. And it worked out well. I attended all elementary schools in New York City. And when I say all, I attended 3 different elementary schools based on where we lived at the particular time and some of the decisions that my parents made. I went to one school from K through 3rd grade, another school for 4th and 5th grade, and then another school for just the 6th grade, all elementary schools. My final elementary school, I was actually bused to that school because that's where sort of the integration of schools became more pronounced. That's when that happened. And it was a wonderful experience for me because while I had one elementary school experience where we had a lot of immigrant students, these students were multiracial, multi-ethnic, multi-religious, the school that I attended in the 6th grade was a predominantly Italian-American elementary school. It was actually called the Vince Lombardi School. And I learned Italian in the 6th grade. That opened sort of my aperture to the fact that, here we are living in the same borough, Brooklyn, but our lived experiences have some differences and have some commonalities. Then went on to middle school, or what we call junior high school. Back in the day, went on to high school. And I was on a trajectory. I was a STEM student from very early on in elementary school. And my goal at that time was to become a pediatrician. And it was because, you look for yourself in the people you interact with. And I was enamored with my pediatrician. She's a Black woman. And I felt like if she could do this, I could do this. And I could help children who weren't feeling well. So I went on to high school right here, again, in the 9th Congressional District, Edward R. Murrow High School. But within my family, at the same time, my parents came to the United States as foreign students. And they were matriculating through sort of the undergraduate, graduate, postgraduate learning themselves. And so the expectation that my brother and I would go on to college, it was a no-brainer. It was sort of the way we lived as a family. And I ended up getting a scholarship to Oberlin College. And Oberlin College is a private college in Ohio. Mind you, I'm a Brooklyn girl, know nothing about the Midwest, but I'm also an adventurer. I mentioned that my parents were immigrants. They came from the Caribbean. They came from the island nation of Jamaica. Now, I had traveled to Jamaica on many occasions, but the rest of the United States, outside of like the coastal states, I'd never been to. And so I went to Oberlin College with a view to ultimately becoming a pediatrician. And I started feeling a tug, if you will. And that tug was more towards the activist side of things. At the time in my college, which was in the early 80s, they were grappling with the apartheid regime in South Africa. And let me back up a bit. Being raised in Central Brooklyn, it was also an activist era for Brooklyn. I call it the precursor, quite frankly, to Black Lives Matter. Just the climate that we were in. This was like shortly after the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Malcolm X, and there was a lot of, consciousness around what was happening in Black communities to Black people. And that informs also my education in my formative years. But I get to Oberlin's campus, and students from across the country, even international students are there, and everyone is activist. Folks are concerned about one another. They're concerned about what's happening on the globe. They're concerned about how our college may be complicit with some of these things. And so I gravitated more towards how do we change things so that people, don't have to experience distress in a society that can be very discriminatory, that can hold them back based on their race. And I then went into changing my major to government and public policy. And from there, I made a commitment. I was a recipient of a scholarship outside of the scholarship to Oberlin that the college provided. There's one called the Randolph Evans Scholarship. It still exists here in Central Brooklyn. Randolph Evans was one of the first protest movements that I got engaged in. It was a young man teenager that was killed by a police officer back in the 1970s. And fast forward, my family and I are a part of this protest movement. I'm gearing up, getting ready for college. The Randolph Evans Scholarship is established. I apply for it. I become a recipient. And one of the provisions or requirements of the scholarship was that I would come back to the community in which I lived and use all of the education and talent I had to change people's lives. So there you have it. I get to Oberlin, I become a public policy major. I graduate from Oberlin, come back to Brooklyn, my neighborhood, and start a career in public service, starting at a very local nonprofit organization storefront right here in the 9th Congressional District. And from there, I just progressed, held a number of positions that help people directly, that were of service to people, that help them navigate some of the same challenges we're facing today. One of the first organization I worked with was an organization called the Erasmus Neighborhood Federation. And this organization worked with local tenants associations to help them to apply pressure to their landlords for services that they weren't getting in their buildings, whether it was heating, safety, whatever the circumstances were. And so I was part of a community organizing effort, went on to serve as a director of youth services for one of our major labor organizations here. It's known as SEIU 1199 today. When I worked for them, they were local 1199. Again, giving service to young people, because I was always enamored with our youth and the next generation. Went on to serve as director of the Bronx portion of the Empowerment Zone, which was a community development program that came from the federal government to provide opportunities for small businesses, for communities to engage in a rebuilding effort, because during that time, the South Bronx had gone through a very tumultuous period, and we're trying to rebuild out of it. And the federal government designated them an empowerment zone. From that position, I then ran locally here in New York City for the New York City Council to succeed my mother, who was a council member by that time in office. I was successful, served in the New York City Council for 6 years, and then ran for the United States House of Representatives, where I've been serving ever since. And so there was a trajectory, there was a confluence of influences that drove my passion for public service. And I gave you a quick snapshot of that based on how local, my influencers were, and what drives my passion for the work that I do in Washington, D.C. today. So you can do well, the sky's the limit when you're in, as long as you're devoted and you're focused. And you have a passion or a love of learning. And that's something you develop when there's a goal that you have in mind. I wasn't sure where I would serve. I always knew that it gave me great gratification to serve other people. And I found different ways of doing that, having learned theoretically through public policy and government how that gets done.
Yeah, see that story. I love the passion, and I think a lot of our students really look for, you're thinking you initially being a pediatrician, and students are sort of like, what can I do? What I want to do? But like you, kind of just catching fire when you realized this is what I'm passionate about. This is what I'm going to do. So helping our students to sort of identify what pathway might be, and they may not find out till they get to college or whatever their pathway might be. They'll try something different. Hearing you talk about it, I think is exceptional. If you could touch a little bit too on, it sounded like you persevered, to get through to the pathway that you wanted to get to. And especially now during COVID, we've got a lot of students who are kind of struggling to kind of stay on track of their dreams? And what are some things that some advice you might give for, times are a little tough now, how they can sort of forge through like you did back in the day?
I want to let our students know that everything that you learn right now can be applied in multiple ways. It's about being creative. Now, I started out as a STEM student, and what's great about that is that the analytical ability that I apply to the work that I do in policy analysis and developing policies there's a direct correlation through some of the theories that I learned in STEM. And I'm able to speak to scientists, to a whole host of folks within the technology space, because I have that foundation in STEM, while at the same time moving forward as being a voice for people, as being an advocate, as drafting legislation. So don't limit yourself. Learn as much as you can, acquire as much skill as you can, and you will find different ways to apply them. You may, in the long run, after your education, decide you want to start a business as opposed to going out to seek a job. Then what skills do you need right now? What are you looking at in terms of how entrepreneurs make their way into the business world? There's so much that we can learn from others, and there's so much that we can learn right now, given the technological advances we have in our lives, the adoption of virtual life, if you will. Use that. I mean, you can Google anything. You can, learn just about anything online, as long as you have access to the technology. And I think that that's one of my battles in Washington, is making sure that our students have access to broadband, to Wi-Fi, to all of the tools that they need. And then don't be shy. That's the other thing that I would definitely share with our students. Research someone who's doing something that interests you, and then reach out to them. You can DM them, as you young people like to do. You can, read up on them, impress them with your knowledge of what they do and how they do it. We are all far more accessible now than folks were when I was your age. And so I want to encourage you to be creative. I happen to be left-handed, so I'm creative by nature, but there are always more than one way to skin a cat. Don't ever limit yourself to one way. And if that one way doesn't work, you always should have a plan B, plan C, a plan D.
Yeah, no, that's great advice. I know I've had to take up plan C and D many times in the past when that wasn't the original plan. But I think it's real interesting. You mentioned that technology, and I know you're on the subcommittee for technology, and you're also on the smart cities, which you like to also call communities caucus, which, I love the focus of that. You could sort of have 4 areas that you focus on. You try and bring them together. We have some rural students from upstate New York too that you're really advocate for kind of closing the digital divide and using technology. What are some ways maybe that our students could, who may feel a little isolated in some of these areas, and talk a little bit about some of the stuff you're working on to sort of use those digital tools to be successful?
Absolutely. I am enamored with technology and technological advances. I examine it very closely for the good that it can do in society and the harm that it can cause in society. I happen to now chair the subcommittee on Homeland Security for cybersecurity. And I have, throughout my tenure in Washington, looked at how we could use technology to spur innovation and opportunity. Right now, one of the most pressing issues for all of our nation, quite frankly, our globe, is climate change. And, we're all on borrowed time with fossil fuels, as a means of obtaining energy. And we know that. But the technology exists for us to transform our environment into a clean energy environment. And I'm obsessed with that. we're going to need to develop a whole new industry around how we transition ourselves, and then how we maintain that infrastructure for energy delivery in every corner of our nation, in the hood and in rural communities. And each area of our nation has something unique and special about them that they can contribute to that clean energy future. We're not talking to the young folks who live in these areas and what their dreams and aspirations are. So what I would say, particularly to our rural students, is we need to hear your voice. You know, I'm sure that you know at least 10 people who live in your area, whether they attend a religious institution with you or they're in your class. You all can be extremely influential in sharing your lived experiences. And not only sharing your lived experiences, but sharing your dreams for how it can change. You would be surprised how many people will respond to that, because people don't know what they don't know. And when we speculate about other people's lived experiences, it's never as on spot as when the person who lives that experience is influencing how the decisions are made. So what I would encourage students, whether they're in rural, suburban, or urban areas, is that organizing that community of interest that you can develop can be very influential, extremely helpful in shaping your own futures.
Yeah, that's great advice. You know, a lot of our rural students do feel like, you know, they've never been to a city, and some of them are thinking about of doing that, going to NYU or wherever, and then going back to the community like you did and having an impact in their community, but gaining some knowledge and ability in a different area.
Absolutely. And what I would say, you know, we attribute to rural communities sort of farming and agriculture. Agriculture in the 21st century is going to be totally different because of climate change. Your observations in that regard will be transformative of the future of agriculture in the United States. Whether it, you know, likewise with livestock and a whole host of other things, we've got to look at how we, one, have succession on the farm, and two, how we modernize the farm, how we modernize agriculture in our society. What does society demand of us to enable to maintain an ecosystem that won't exacerbate climate change? You all have the answers to that.
What are that's a great segue into, you know, some of the things we teach are essential skills, otherwise known as soft skills. So it's non-academic stuff. It's like we have employers tell us all the time, we can teach this graduate the job, but they need communication skills, perseverance, leadership, these skills that we're trying to help develop. What are some key ones you think? I mean, especially in your position, you think in the House, you dealing with both sides of the aisle, different people, you know, trying to communicate to get your agenda across. What are some of the key skills for you that our students, you would say to them, hey, you really could use these to be successful?
Yes, there are a couple of things. You know, everyone has different personalities, but curiosity is very, very important. Being curious about circumstances that aren't quite yours, curious about other people, curious about you know, the world around you, and not holding fast to certain beliefs without saying, why is it this way? Asking the question why is always very important. I like to say that that's important, curiosity. Being fearless is another one. You know, oftentimes fear paralyzes folks, and it's really, you know, something we can all press through when we build sort of the intestinal fortitude and courage to press beyond those circumstances, to seek out help, to find others who are experiencing similar things and looking at ways to address those problems, looking at ways to get help, to get beyond those fears. I think that those are very important. Courage is important. You know, and courage and fear are like two sides of a coin. Because when you fear something, you will ultimately not only hurt yourself, but hurt others. And the goal is, you know, to find sort of common humanity and know that, you know, everything can work together for your benefit, even the bad experiences, if you get past them. Not to say you ignore them, but you acknowledge them and say, that was yesterday, this is today. But when you carry that luggage of fear and bad experiences with you, you get weighed down. You get weighed down. And so I mean, it sounds somewhat esoteric, but these are basic human sort of conditions that we don't acknowledge enough. And during this pandemic, it's important that we get to the essence of things, because people are afraid right now for several different reasons, right? Starting with our health. But, you know, for students who are currently learning remotely, will I get everything that I need to get in order to accomplish my goals? Is it worth it? You know, and if it's not worth it, what am I going to do with my life? You know, how do you get a job in a virtual, you know, how do you start a business when people can't come together right now? So there's planning that's very important as part of our lives. And like I said, it's not one plan. Plan A, plan B, you have to be nimble and be able to adjust and look at how you can use the multitude of your talents to blaze your trail in life.
Yeah, that's inspirational. So things that, you know, you kind of work on your whole life. I'm still working on some of those, you know, I mean.
Absolutely.
And we've got, so some of our young, on your website, I love the fact that you kind of walk the walk. You've got resources for parents, for students, educational resources. But I like mentoring is a big piece for us. And you have some stuff on your website about everything you just said. A good place for a young person, I would assume you would think, would be to job shadow or mentor work with somebody who can help you work on those skills, and they can explain how they got there. Are there some ideas you have? And your website is just chock full of really good information. You do, I see you do internships, you set up a whole host of things. What are some things that you would suggest students could do in addition to school, where they acquire some of the skills you just mentioned, and really get in there to kind of experience and work on these skills you say they need?
The first thing, learn how to research. You know, do your due diligence, as we say in Washington, D.C. Learn as much about what it is you're pursuing that you can possibly learn, right? I'm not saying go overboard, but through that, you're going to see the names of people in articles. You're going to see people's names in bylines. These are people who maybe created the article. They have a connection to the person or the issue that you're interested in and can actually connect you with that. Most people like to help students. Most people will really, they feel honored to be able to do something intergenerationally. So, you know, this is a perfect time to look at, you know, what it is that you're curious about, and then connect with someone who is in the midst of addressing that curiosity, and build from there. And there may be multiple people in that space with varying theories on the same issue, right? So, you know, people really like to be reached out to by students. And if they don't have the time or the ability at the time, they may be able to refer you to someone who is one of their colleagues in that space. So, you know, I think that this is a perfect time to do research on whatever subject matter, you know, you either working on or you have a curiosity about. Find someone, they may be a neighbor of yours, you never know, who is engaged in something very similar. And then in the same way that we're doing this Q&A today, engage in Q&A with them. Ask them, can we communicate, you know, every 2 weeks? Can we communicate on a monthly basis? I'd like to develop, you know, my understanding of this further. And I think you can be helpful in helping me do that. Don't be shy in asking for help, for reaching out. And, you know, as long as you're not like sort of hardwired on celebrity, because I know young people, it's like, oh, okay, I'm reaching out to Kendrick Lamar tomorrow. No, reach out to the people behind Kendrick Lamar.
Yeah, that's a great.
Reach out to folks in the recording, reach out to, you know, some of the award programs. They all have like mentoring programs, believe it or not. So whether it's the Tony Awards and you're a theater person, whether it's, you know, any of these award programs, they all tend to have some sort of a scholarship program or mentoring program affiliated with them.
Yeah, that's a great point. We'll go into classrooms and I'll say, hey, you know, what do you want to be when you grow up? And all the boys will be like, I want to be a gamer or a pro athlete.
Right.
Like, okay, maybe there are other jobs in, you're probably not going to become a pro athlete. The odds are low, but there's a lot of jobs within pro sports, communications, PR, all these things you can look at.
Absolutely.
I know you get a tight schedule and we appreciate you coming on. I'd love if you want to offer any words of wisdom, or I know you've been on a subcommittee for education. You have a lot of initiatives just within the city you're working on. Anything you want to share that you're working on or think is important?
Well, right now we are focused in Washington, D.C., and I'm extremely focused in Brooklyn, New York, on navigating our communities through the COVID-19 crisis. You know, the impact has so many layers to it. And the idea is to come into a post-COVID existence as a society that does not take us back to a post-COVID existence, if you can understand what I'm saying. This year, we saw protest movements. We saw an attack on the Capitol in Washington, D.C. We saw people losing their loved ones left and right to this virus. There are so many ways in which we have to improve our society in order to protect our people. And every one of you who are students can play a role in one form or fashion. You know, what I've learned is that, you know, when I was your age and younger, in New York City, we had a public health infrastructure. And over time, they began to divest from it. That divestment left us vulnerable to a really bad circumstance like the one we found ourselves in with COVID-19. So that, you know, we're scrambling to test people, we're scrambling to have supplies, we're scrambling to do all of these things, when at one point in our society, we saw it to important to have these public health stations in place. And I would assume that that happened, and we can do the research on it, because we'd had pandemics in the past. It was centuries ago. And, you know, the communicable diseases of that time were, you know, we had not had vaccines yet for them. And so they had to have ways that each community could connect. Now, this was New York City, very densely populated area. It's not this way across the nation, not even across the state, don't get me wrong. But what if we had maintained that, right? could we have put ourselves in a better position than the one we find ourselves in today? These are the questions that I ask. These are the things that I work on. I know that in the midst of this, my students had to go remote learning, and they were going back and forth between going to school, what is the implication of that generation of students that have had to experience this? I didn't have to. And there will be generations after you that won't have to. But what is going to be special about you as students? How do we help you to reach your ultimate potential given the disruption and the abrupt adoption of a new way of learning? You guys can answer that question. What can we do for you? How can we make sure that coming out of the federal government, coming out of the state government, coming out of the city government are policies that are targeted to your needs specifically? These are the things that I work on. And these are the things I want to engage you in.
I love we don't often ask students what they want. We think we can tell them, what we think they need. Love the way you put that, and that they can actually, what they can tell us. How can we help you? And I'll have them send you some questions if you don't mind later. And
absolutely.
Yeah, I can't tell you how much honored to have you on, and I'm inspired just hearing you talk. And we'll share this with schools in El Paso, Atlanta. We'll share them all over. So I know it'll mean a lot to our students. So thank you so much for coming on.
And thank you for having me, John. Great to be with you. And I look forward to seeing you again in the future. Anything that we can do to be helpful to you and your students, don't hesitate to reach out.
Thanks so much. We really appreciate that.
Good Everyone, luck. Take care. Stay safe. Stay healthy. Stay strong. Wear your mask. Hello, young people. And when it's your time, get the vaccine.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
I've already received both doses of vaccines and I'm doing okay. I'm doing well.
Nice. Yeah, my wife's a nurse. She just got both as well.
All very good. Well. That's right. We got to get our young people on board. Do it for the elders if you must.
Yeah.
Take care, everybody.
All right. Take care.
Bye-bye.